Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan J. Haraja and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan J. Haraja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We're glad to have you with us. We're going to take a quick look at what we think the future of the college football playoff is going to look like after we've had the majority of this 12-team playoff, the first season of it, and, some other parting thoughts as we move forward. So first, before I forget, I just want to thank all of you for listening. I want to thank our producer, Joey Aliberti, before we dive into this. Shehan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. It's been a fun year. It's been an exciting, debut of the expanded college football playoff. So many of the things that I hoped and that we hoped would happen, I think have happened to this point. And I think it's just been a really thrilling time to be a college football fan.
Yeah, and we were all looking forward to this three-team playoff. I mean, pardon me, three-team. My gosh, this 12-team playoff.
You're going the wrong direction.
Yeah, wrong. We need to go back. We need to go back to not only two. We need to go back to the BCS. No, we do not. It's been fascinating to watch. So many of the teams that got auto bids just didn't make it. That I should say got the first round buys just didn't quite perform. And it was interesting to see because the evolution of the conversation that we've seen heading into the 12-team playoff, there was a lot of, X team should have made it in over Y team, and it ends up X team lost to Michigan. All these kinds of conversations. Then the first round home field playoffs take place, and we saw all the favorites win. But then, the big conversation was, did we expand it to be too far? And while we're at it, Arizona State doesn't deserve to be there. And then Arizona State puts up arguably the best fight of them all in the quarterfinals. There's so much conversation that went into this. And I've heard it said before, but sometimes you just want to see how it all plays out before you make any final judgments. And I think we saw illustrations of that so far to kind of paint that picture.
No, I think you're right. And I mean, look, we obviously have had some clunkers in the playoff to this point. We've had some blowouts in the playoff to this point, but we've also had obviously a couple of really amazing games. And I think that people are thinking a little too small about how this playoff was designed to work. And it's not just the individual games that we get to value. It's the way that it impacted the entire regular season. We got to enjoy the group of five subplot between Boise State and UNLV. And then all of a sudden you get Army in there. And then all of a sudden Tulane is in there. And it was so exciting to follow this season. I'd make the case that this is the most exciting regular season actually that I've covered in a great many years. I just think that people were more locked in on more games. Everybody was worried about the regular season not mattering as much. But the reality is, for the vast majority of teams in college football, the regular season mattered more than ever for them. And I think that this has just been such, to me, at this point, a success. And look, I mean, so this format was announced back when it was me and Doug doing this show. Back in 21, 22. It's been several years at this point. And immediately when the format was released, it was very clear. They wanted to prioritize certain things. They wanted to emphasize conference championships. I think that conference championships have been validated in many ways. We see a play-in game in the Big 12 championship game that obviously has huge implications, and Arizona State gets in the field and they get their shot against Texas. And, if this doesn't happen, Cam Scadaboo isn't a household name for college football fans. They wanted to emphasize the group of five. We got to see that with one of the best group of five teams that we've seen in a very long time, along with one of the best group of five players we've really ever seen in Boise State's Ashton Jeanty. This has just been such a success for restructuring. And I want to point this out too. I think that people need to understand this isn't a short-term thing. This is, I think, a long-term restructuring of the sport that's only going to make sort of comprehensive college football more valuable. And look, maybe some people don't like that. Maybe some people only want to have to know about 6 teams. I just don't think that it's ever been the ethos of this show, and certainly for me at CBS and you at Reddit, our coverage of this sports.
It is absolutely fascinating to think that, and this is something that really struck me, particularly after the Rose Bowl was wrapped up. In the old playoff, right? I mean, let's go back. Every version we've had of trying to crown a national championship, Ohio State wouldn't have been part of the conversation. They just wouldn't have. They would have missed out. They would have missed out every single point. And yeah, there was obviously their ranking, their 8th seed was a little bit pushed down because they had to fit 2 teams up, but they still wouldn't have been part of the conversation. They would have not been in the top 4. And now they look, especially because, I mean, at this point, we still got a couple more games to go. They look unstoppable. It's wild to think that wouldn't have been included. And this, to me, and it's weird to say this, I never would have thought Ohio State would have become the grand argument of why we need to include more teams. I mean, they're never the team you think of as the team that is oh shucks, they got their chance and they're making the most of it, but they really are. They're just so good right now that we don't even think of them as that lovable underdog. I mean, but really, I mean, they were lower seed than Arizona State, and they weren't that far behind them in the. I mean, Arizona State was behind them in the final ranking, but it is stunning. It is absolutely stunning to me to see that, and that to me, if they end up winning it all, and I know the area your favor, but even if they end up, getting to where they have now, they are the best argument for this is why there's a benefit to having an expanded playoff. You can have a team that gets hot. I mean, we've talked about that before. There have been some great teams all over. I mean, my background is obviously I'm a USC alum, so I still remember some of those Pete Carroll teams that would drop a game early, and then suddenly look unstoppable towards the end and not really get a shot because they lost that game early on in the season. But there's been plenty of teams across college football that have been in those situations, and this is the opportunity. I think one of the mistakes that some of the more knee-jerk reactions that have come out of this is just because one game wasn't good, this playoff is a mess. I remember somebody had that reaction. It's like the Boise State after the Fiesta Bowl, like, I just give me one close college football quarterfinal. And I'm glad the pushback that happened to that. It's like, y'all remember some of the BCS games we got where we had number 1 versus number 2, and it ended up being a complete mismatch, or even semifinal games that ended up being a complete mismatch because it was a disaster. Like, you're going to get those games. Those are part of it. As much as we would love to. Last year, we were spoiled. The final year of the 14 playoff, we had 2 just classics as semifinals. 2 games that went down to the final play in overtime and in the regular regulation. And that was the exception rather than the rule. Usually you're going to get a game that is completely off the rails. And we had a few here that got close to it. I don't know if anyone would quite be the bottom of the. I mean, it's hard to top the unfortunate TCU Georgia national championship game, but
by the way, a team that won a playoff game. By the way, that's the thing that everybody just decides to ignore, is that some of the biggest blowouts that we've ever had have involved teams that actually won playoff games. There's a 52-24 Clemson over Alabama win. Like this isn't new. And it's not just teams that, quote unquote, don't deserve to be there that are on the wrong side of some of these performances.
I was about to say, I mean, gosh, whoever thought Oregon would be the team that might have made the argument that, maybe if you win your conference championship, you shouldn't get an automatic first round bye. Like, wow, the way that game developed was just, I mean, I think everyone, I know I mentioned it last episode, but I can't get enough of Dan Lanning's halftime interview. He had a smirk of like, what am I even supposed to say at this point? We all see what's happening. I see what's happening. It's hard to beat a team twice in the same season, but my gosh, that was, yeah, exactly. I mean, sometimes you can't say that it's just because a team was ranked a little lower or came from a conference that might not be as prestigious. Sometimes a team just either steps up or doesn't quite step up, and sometimes it happens in the same game, and you get a result like that.
Well, so look, I think that both of us have enjoyed this system and this first year of the playoff to this point. And just for some perspective, we're recording this episode on January 2nd before the Sugar Bowl. So, if something crazy happens, we might not have all the context. But I did want to ask, so after this first little bit of the playoff, I'm curious, let's look into the future just a little bit. Let's look forward just a little bit. And I'll start with this. I want to go through and kind of think of some predictions for what's going to happen over the next couple of years with this format. Whether it's, here's going to be a positive consequence, here's going to be a negative consequence, here's how the system might change. Like, we're putting on our future hats. We're jumping into our time machine and looking forward just a little bit. And I'll start, of course. So I think that one thing that's going to happen is I think that we are in the lower part of the 12 team rankings. I think that the teams that rank 9 through 12 every year, I think that those are going to be actually long term the biggest winners of the college football playoff. And here's why I say that. Okay, let's take SMU, a school that's right 15 minutes down the road from me. This is a program that obviously has not played nationally, not had national success for quite literally 40 years, since the 1980s when they were competing for national championships. Well, my sister is an SMU alum who does not care about college football whatsoever. I tried to drag her to a football game. I managed to get her to one, and it was a Friday game that I was like, I can attend it with you, but otherwise she did not care. Well, when SMU made the college football playoff, even she was talking about it. Even she was excited. She's like, wait, we're in like the playoff. We're like getting to compete for, like, that's crazy, even for people who don't care. So for the schools like Indiana, SMU, Arizona State, of course, Clemson is already there. Boise State, of course, like these schools, I think are going to see an explosion of investment and care in those programs. I went to Baylor, as people know, in the mid 2010s. And when RG3 won the Heisman, it made people understand what was possible if you're good at football. And you started to see they built a brand new stadium that opened in 2014. They won 2 Big 12 titles. They invested at a much higher level, even after, of course, the former coach was let go. They hired Matt Rule. They hired Dave Aranda. They invested at a high level. Like, that was something that has had 10, 15-year effects after the fact. Texas A&M, I think you can argue the same thing with Johnny Manziel, right? They go 11-2 in their first season in the SEC, and that's enough. They invest at a high level, and you see like the program that is what it is right now. Now, like Baylor and Texas A&M, that doesn't mean that they're going to suddenly win national championships. I don't think that Kurt Cignetti necessarily is going to be holding up the trophy in 2027, but I do think that these are going to be legitimate inflection points. And that's not just true of the 2024 season. I think you're going to see that in 25 and 26 and 27. I mean, the thing that I point to all the time is that Ashton Jeanty probably does not come back to Boise State if the expanded college football playoff does not exist. But he knew, one, I can have a competitive compensation package. It's not as much as I could get other places, but competitive. 2, I want to be here. I like it here. I love it here. I love my teammates and coaches. I want to be a part of this program. And 3, I can accomplish the same thing at Boise State by making the college football playoff and being on the national stage as I can at LSU or Auburn or wherever else, right? And I think that those 3 factors all came together to create the season that Boise State had. Well, again, we had this conversation last year about Quinyon Mitchell, the cornerback at Toledo, right? Who just wanted to be part of Toledo, who just loved Toledo and felt really committed to it. I think that we're going to see more and more players as the years go on feel committed to a program, even if it isn't the biggest and brightest and best, because they know that their program might have access to doing something historic that's never been done before. So I actually think that over the next 5 years, the last couple teams in are going to be the biggest winners of the college football playoff.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that's a great opportunity for these teams. And I think particularly for a school that has a big alumni base that can throw in money and maybe has in another sport like Indiana, you'll get that kind of interest coming in. Imagine, I mean, there's plenty of teams more at the P4 level, and I apologize to because the G5 always kind of has, unless you're just a massive university that can suddenly tap into an enormous alumni base, or perhaps teams like at SMU where it's like, no, we have been good before and we have that money, we have that energy, we just need them to get galvanized. Boy, SMU in a way galvanized at the right time, like unexpectedly. They had the right champions to argue that, I know it's going to cost a lot of money because we're going to not take the full revenue share and we're going to need $100 million, whatever it was, to buy our way in. They picked the right time because now SMU, you're right. Look, as you pointed out, like now people care. I mean, but even, I remember Washington. Washington has historically been football a good team, like not quite the elite, unstoppable, but every now and again can get their way into the national title conversation. They certainly have that history and a couple of championships to go with it. Last year, I had people who I know were, from Seattle, not necessarily big college football fans at all, any sports really at all, suddenly say like, yeah, what do you think? How do you think they're going to do in the game? And you're just kind of like, oh, wow, this is remarkable to hear people in the Pacific Northwest, interested in college football as almost casual fans. And I think it's a lovely thing to see. And I hope we see more of it, particularly as a 12-team playoff includes teams that wouldn't normally get there. It's fun too. I mean, what I liked about this year, not so much SMU, because we knew they were a dark horse candidate. I know you had put them, especially as a dark horse candidate, to be a part of it before the season, and that was not an unfashionable idea. But Indiana, if you can be in Indiana, a completely out of nowhere program, one hiring, you can say what you will about TCU, but it's not like Sonny Dykes wasn't a good coach before. I mean, he built the foundation that SMU is kind of climbing on right now. But to have an Indiana do that, and get into the 12-team playoff, you have the opportunity now for teams to rise up, which they simply did not. It used to take years of attempts, and then maybe you'll get considered. Certainly not for the BCS. In the BCS area, you were just hoping to get into a New Year's Six bowl, and then hope all your players played in it. But now with the 4-team, it was still hard. I mean, we had that Cincinnati year, that was neat. We had the TCU year, that was neat. But now there are opportunities out there, and it's good because some of these teams, college football is a sport where you can see some pretty big changes in a couple of years. Now, I'm not saying, and I think we both agree, it takes years to necessarily get to be a national champion. You need the recruits, you need the line. I mean, one thing we saw is physicality on the line and just the ability to handle wear and tear. Those guys there are a finite number, and you are fighting for them, but you can get yourself into position to be in a puncher's chance. And then some of these teams, I mean, Boise State had some mental errors early on. They, at one point they got it within 3 and it didn't quite work out. And part of it was the sheer physicality of Penn State wearing them down. But had they had some of those early opportunities, not blow some field goals, not, have some empty, they could have made that a real close game. And those are the kinds of moments that get you to move forward. We had teams like Arizona State. I mean, we talked about that game a lot last episode. That was absolutely a phenomenal example of sometimes a team just gets off the mat and keeps going. And sometimes, it's just, I think so much of this will offer opportunities for these teams. And yeah, I'm absolutely fascinated to see how that moves forward. One thing that I'm curious to see if it evolves is how we do the seeding. I'm very curious to see if we're going to see some of that because, I mean, jokes about Oregon aside, they were going to be the number 1 seed no matter what. I mean, they were the only undefeated team playing, and they actually beat the team that clobbered them before. So, I mean, it is what it is. But, especially with, I think Penn State is going to be the most interesting one to see discussed in the long term because I think that's the one that had the most interesting argument. You lose the Big Ten championship game, and then you not accidentally, but you end up in a path that some will probably continue to argue is one of the easiest paths out there. If we start to see, and I'm not going to say things should be changed because of this 12-team playoff. I know I can just wait for the offseason when we're going to hear the commissioners of the Big Ten and SEC talk about this. But I mean, I think I'd like to see a more of a long run to see if there is this pattern that starts to form that odd teams that you wouldn't expect end up having an easier path because they lost their conference championship game, which, we were talking about whether to play a conference championship game. Obviously, Lane Kiffin had brought that up earlier in the season. And even before the season started, there was that kind of conversation of, is there a benefit for playing this? I know you're an advocate of saying that bye week would benefit teams. Not sure it benefited them all that great, but maybe a little sleepy in their games. Each of them had kind of these moments of like, oh, right, football, against a team that had just come off of a victory. But yeah, I'm wondering if we'll see some shift there. What do you think about that aspect of it?
No, I think that that's fair. So, for me, I have been a strong proponent that I think that it's very important that conference championships are rewarded. But I think it is fair to say, right, that this was pretty stark. A team in Arizona State jumping from 12-4 with Boise State, they jumped from 9-3. Like it is pretty stark. I think that some of the seeding stuff is a little overblown because, like, here's the reality. I said it all year. The best team in the country is Ohio State, and they did two really dumb things during the regular season. And there's no postseason system that's going to protect you from the best team in the country doing dumb stuff. Like I've made the comparison before. It's the 2013-14 Spurs who kind of coasted the regular season to set themselves up well for the playoffs and be healthy, right? It's Patrick Mahomes sitting out a couple games mid-season and coming back in the playoffs and obviously being the best player in the world, right? Like you can't totally protect against that. So I did actually go through, and so what we would have had if if it was seeded similar to the rankings. Now I want to be clear, it wouldn't be the top 12 teams still, because Alabama would have been replaced with a fifth conference champion in Clemson. I don't think that's going anywhere. I also think that it would be a huge mistake for that to go anywhere. I do think we will have 5 conference champion auto bids. I think that will continue. But what we'd be looking at are the teams with the buys would have been Oregon, Georgia, Texas, Penn State in that order. So actually the 4 teams that played in a conference championship game, which I don't think that people should be too mad about that, right? Like they did have to play an extra game, which is significant. I do feel like the reward of winning that game becomes quite a bit smaller, which kind of sucks. I think that is a really positive consequence that we got to see, is that, again, Oregon and Georgia got to be top 2 seeds because of it. But I also get it. So what we would have been looking at is we would have had Notre Dame as the 5, which, by the way, Notre Dame would be eligible to get a first round bye in this system because it wouldn't require a conference championship, but they would not in this scenario. So we'd have Notre Dame versus Clemson. We would have Ohio State versus Arizona State. Don't like that matchup, I'll be honest. We'd have Tennessee versus SMU. We'd have Indiana versus Boise State. So, like, if we're just doing a television product, which, by the way, I do hate that we try to, like, come forward with this television product stuff, because, like, I don't care. Like, nobody watches the NFL playoffs and are like, well, the Chiefs Packers would do really well ratings. Let's get the Cowboys in there. I mean, they get such good ratings. Now we do get this a little bit, as I can remember, with the MLB, where everybody complained when it was the Rangers versus the Diamondbacks, even though they were the 2 freaking best teams in the league. But anyway, that's enough of my Dallas, Texas brain talking. But I do think that we would have some interesting matchups. I do think that I'd consider myself a little still on the fence about how I feel about getting rid of the auto buys for champions, because I really want championships to matter. I think that is so important to this system being good and making sense and working long term. But again, when I look at those matchups, I do think that there is some reasonableness to it, right? Like I do think that Indiana Boise State would be a great game. I think that Tennessee SMU would have been a lot more competitive of a game. And one of the things that I've said long term is that I feel like what is so cool about this is, like, we're thinking of Cinderellas from the perspective of, like, can an 11 seed win the national title? Well, no, that's stupid. We don't even think about that in March Madness, right? Like, it's very rare that an actual, like, outside of the top 4 seed actually wins the national championship. That's really not the point. It's whether a team can pull an upset and go on a run. Like, for example, if Arizona State beat Texas and got blasted by Ohio State in the next round, I would still consider that a Cinderella. Like, I would still consider that a big upset. I'd consider that a team that we still talked about forever, as a Cinderella type team. I think you really only have to get 1 or 2 for it to be awesome. And again, like, you'd have Boise State versus Indiana, which if Boise State won, I think that we would consider that to be an upset, and we'd consider that to be like a wow, the group of 5 team beat the team tied for second place in the Big Ten. I think that would still be pretty significant. And the other piece of this too is that I've said all along going into the playoff, one of the things that I love about it is that it creates multiple pathways for a successful season. In March Madness, we have teams whose goals are to win the national championship. We have teams whose goals are to make a Final Four, and we have goals for that a team wants to make the Sweet 16 or win a tournament game. And some just want to make the tournament. Some are just really happy to be there, and I think that that is a positive for college football, not a negative. The fact that Arizona State, that Clemson, that SMU, that Indiana were in the college football playoff makes this a successful season, regardless of what happens next. And so I do think that there probably is something to the idea of making the rankings, the seedings outside of the conference champions getting 5 auto bids. I do think that we might be headed in that direction.
Yeah, one thing you mentioned, and I think you absolutely hit the nail on the head, is the idea of Cinderella isn't that it happens every year. It's that it happens sometimes. And when it does, that rarity of it galvanizes people. And just like, a miracle, for a Cinderella in the basketball tournament is like getting to the Elite Eight or maybe even the Final Four, but no one really expects them to get further than that. That's about right. And then usually by either, I don't know if you want to call it attrition and just sheer talent, kicks in, and it's hard to have.
I mean, we still talk about George Mason, which was
I was thinking of George Mason specifically.
Yeah. Also because Jim Larinaga just retired too, right, from Miami. So again, and we're going to have at some point a team that's the 8, 9, 10 make the semis. And that's a Cinderella. Like that's a huge Cinderella. That's a huge deal. Now, of course, right now it's the 8th seed, which is Ohio State. But you know what I mean, right? Like a team that's not
those plucky Buckeyes,
those plucky Buckeyes. But again, we were a targeting call away from Arizona State being that team, and even though they were quote unquote the 4th seed, like of course everybody would have considered that a big upset in a Cinderella, right? And so I do think for people, it's got to be really weird. And I admit this as somebody who has been a proponent of the system. It's got to be really weird for Arizona State to nominally be the 4 seed and also be 13.5-point underdogs. Like, I do think it's fair to say that probably is a little extreme for that team to be nominally seated higher than the team that they're playing against at the 5 spot. So, I would not consider myself as fully converted to the position that we should get rid of the top 4 buys, but I do think that I am much more open to it than I certainly was entering the playoff.
Yeah, as a quick aside, I do have to say the Big 12 ended up looking the most impressive in bowl season in so many ways. I mean, BYU, if they had been in there, I kind of would have been curious to see how they would have done too. Because Colorado, wow. Anyway, we'll set that aside. One thing though, I did want to kind of add to the whole idea of the Cinderella concept. One of my favorite interviews I ever had with somebody was years ago at I think it was 2016 at Mountain West Media Days. Rocky Long was the San Diego State head coach, always a good quote machine, but also really put thought into everything when he would answer questions. And he said it this way, because at that time, that we were still far away from ever expanding the playoff. And he was just asked about the concern of whether the G5 teams could ever make it in. And he said, he put it this way, and he said, I just want to see 8 teams with 1 G5 guaranteed in. Because he put it this way, he's like, it's not going to happen every year. Once, maybe every 5 to 10 years, the G5 team's going to make a run. And he's like, watch what happens with TV. He's like, watch everyone tune in to watch that plucky, that plucky G5 make it as far as they do. And yeah, absolutely. I think Arizona State, as you said, we're a couple of plays away from potentially being that. And even though they'd be the 4 seed, I guarantee a lot of people would have paid attention, and Ohio State would have probably reveled in being the villain in that kind of scenario. But my goodness, that has been absolutely fantastic. It is interesting to see. I think one thing going forward, we're certainly going to hear more and more chirping about who should have been in and who shouldn't have been in. And as much as it gets annoying at times, I think that's part of what flavors the sport. And then we'll probably see some bowl results that make us go like, are you sure? Are you sure about that one? Well, when we get back from this break, we'll give a couple more thoughts we have on, the future of the college football playoff, as well as give us a bit of a wrap up here for this series. Here on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
So, Sean, what is another kind of change you foresee happening in this college football playoff structure?
Well, I'm really curious to see because I want people to understand through 24 and 25, the system is set, right? Like the initial playoff contract goes through the 2025 playoff. It's 12 years. After that, everything is up in the air. The only thing that's confirmed right now is that it will be an at least 12 team college football playoff starting later. There's no formality at this point about auto bids, about conference champions, or even a final number on how many will get in. So I wanted to get to that conversation. I'm very curious. How many teams do you anticipate will be a part of the college football playoff starting in 2026?
I love that question. So I think we're either going to, well, to me, there's three options. There's 12, 14, or 16. 14 is if they still want to have some kind of reward for the top two seeds. And I don't know, honestly, I'm imagining this now, like if you're the Big Ten commissioner, I don't know how Oregon would be like reacting to it. Like, honestly, it didn't work out so great. I wonder what that what that conversation would be like. Maybe we kind of wanted to play at least one more warm up, tune up game, however you want to put it, because I favored we were cold. I mean, Dan Lanning's whole commentary about we were totally not ready for this. I wonder how much of that is going to play into it. And that would be the difference between a 14 and a 16. Because what if they make it 14 and we start seeing the 1 and 2 seeds get knocked off year after year, and it's going to become like a running gag? I'm genuinely concerned that might become a thing. So I think with what we're expecting to happen when this season wraps up with the Big Ten and the SEC, which, to be fair, I think perennially it's the obligation of those commissioners to push for more access for their teams. Just like it's, I get it.
Sure.
It's like being the NFL commissioner. You're speaking on behalf of the NFL owners and what they want, not what necessarily the fans always want. But I do think we're going to see potentially an expansion to 16, but I don't know. I could see it going to 16 only because, first of all, there's two factors that go into it. People loved unanimously the first round games in home stadiums. I think we're going to see that. Maybe I don't know if the quarterfinals will budge. I don't know how much power the Bulls have in this conversation. I mean, TBD. They think they have a lot of power, but who knows? And the Rose Bowl seems like they're willing to negotiate anything just to keep that. Oddly enough, the Rose Bowl may go from being the one that stops everything from happening because they're very traditional to the one like, we're good. Like we're cool. So I do wonder about that. So I am leaning towards 16 just because everybody will want that extra home game, especially I should say the top 6 top 8. I can't do math. And then I think we'll see that. But I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that if I had to guess right now, I think we probably are looking at 16 for the reason that you said. Now, what I really hope is I really, really, really hope that they don't try to ruin this with guaranteed auto bids for the SEC and the Big Ten. Because, by the way, like if this system existed this year, we already had 4 Big Ten teams in the field. The SEC actually would have had 6 teams in the field, which, okay. Now, I will say, if we had 16 this year, the first team out, do you know who it would have been?
BYU?
BYU. They would have been 17 because they, as a 10-2 team, were ranked behind Clemson as a 3-loss team, even though they had a higher strength of schedule and a road win over a college football playoff team. But anyway, this is all beside the point. Also, the second team out would have been Iowa State. So, man, oh man, starting this new system with 2 Big 12 teams right on the outside would have certainly been something. But that's a conversation for another day. I really hope that they don't do auto bids, like a non-champion auto bids, like guaranteed spots, because I mean, come on. We had this conversation all offseason. It's just anti-competitive at a certain point. Like, for example, if we have a year like this year and we determine, again, I think that it was wrong, but if the committee determines the top 16 teams only includes one Big 12 team, like, so be it. So be it. Why should the Big 12 even get a second team? Why should, let's say that Indiana wasn't good this year, right? So then all of a sudden you have to leave out multiple teams so that you can include number 20 Illinois, right? Like, that's what we'd be doing. That just makes absolutely no sense to me. And I do think that that sort of thing is probably more of a bargaining chip than it is a legitimate suggestion. But like, let's get ahead of it now. That would be terrible for college football because it would also mean that, like again, I want conference championships to matter. And like, yeah, being the top ranked of the top 4 SEC teams, like, I guess that's something, but it's not really that much. It's not really that good. It's not really that different than I don't know. That's all beside the point. But I think we will see 16. I think that the home playoff game point is absolutely right. Like, that is something that I think that schools have to look at and be like, oh man, I wish that I got that opportunity. You know, we saw it this year, right? Georgia didn't get a home playoff game. Oregon didn't get a home playoff game. Like, so many of these teams didn't actually get that opportunity. By the way, like, they were one off, but if Boise State was one spot higher, we would have gotten to see a home playoff game at Boise State University. What kind of marketing would that be for that program and that university? Going back to the blue turf, right? So I do think that we are likely to expand to 16. The other thing, too, just based off of this year, is that with 5 conference champions, the 5th one was Clemson, who was number 16. Like, I think that 16 is most of the time going to be enough. You know, sometimes we'll have to probably include a group of 5 team that's just outside of the top 16, but like, probably not a lot outside of the top 16 most years, right? Like maybe 2021. So I think that 16 is probably the number that we're going to settle at. I mean, 14 is just like, it's a weird number, man. Like, I like 12. I kind of would be fine with staying at 12, but 14 is like a weird, like, pseudo compromise that I don't think really makes anybody happy.
Yeah.
And I've also been on the record too, right? Like, people go into this thing with like, I would rather deserving teams get left out than non-deserving teams play for a title. I'm totally like, I don't care about that. That's stupid.
I don't care.
If there
Things
is a
will work
team,
their way out.
yeah, if there's a team that deserves to play for a national championship, like, they should play for a national championship. Like, because again, everybody thinks of it from the perspective of like, oh well, like, number 5 Alabama, well, like, they had their chance, but like, what ends up actually happening is undefeated UCF doesn't get to play for a national championship. Undefeated Florida State doesn't get to play for a championship. One loss Baylor and TCU don't get to play for a championship. The teams that get left out are always the ones that were deserving and wouldn't have this chance otherwise. It's so rare that the deserving team left out is a great team or is a blue blood team, right? Like, usually that team backdoors their way in. So I would rather have a slightly more, again, to the point of being a little inflated. I think 12 is a good number, but like, I'd rather be at 16 and end this. And the other piece of this too, and we said this beforehand, but like, I think that this would be even more true in an expanded system. Like, Alabama losing to Michigan was very funny. But like, Alabama having to go into the college football playoff, do you know who they would have played in the first round in this system?
Who?
Ohio State. They would have lost by 40 points if they had played. And all of the mystique about like, well, it's Bama and they have the number 1 talent composite roster in the country would immediately be gone. Like, it would immediately be gone. And I think that that's good. Like, I think that seeing these teams play games that matter and prove that they don't belong is actually a good thing, as opposed to just imagining which teams we think do and don't belong. Because I'll tell you what, a lot of people would not have said that Arizona State University belongs in the college football playoff or that they're deserving of playing for a national championship. But like, look at how they played. Look at what they did. Look at the actual game. And I think that they, in many ways, proved that they could hang and that they deserved a chance. So I do think I do think ultimately that that will settle at 16, and I think that's going to be a good number that long term has a lot of a lot of good stuff.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing where this goes. I mean, I was happy with the way the 12-team playoff has developed out. I think, as we touched on early on, the regular season was absolutely the most exciting we've ever had because so many games, but so many teams in the conversation. I mean, we talked. I mean, granted, they were the unfortunate leading edge of the Ohio State crush machine, but watching Tennessee go from being outside to suddenly being not only inside but the 7th seed was fascinating. So we're going to see lots of sudden changes, sudden movements, teams that can suddenly get their way in unexpectedly. There's so many variables here that it is hard to predict, and that's great because college football is that the fact that the games get played on the field are what makes college football so fun. The fact that we can talk about it, but then games happen and you're like, I did not foresee that. I did not foresee Michigan also taking out Alabama the way they did. There were so many things that happened even during the bowl season that we just didn't see happening. I did not see Colorado deciding, give them credit. Shore played both halves. I never thought we'd have to say that as a qualification for any quarterback right now. But I mean, sometimes it's hard. Jalen Milroe played both halves. A certain other quarterback did not. But I think this has been absolutely a fascinating way to bring it together. Well, as we kind of get to sort of the end of this episode, we wanted to say, first of all, we're going to be going on a hiatus. We're not sure how long. We'll go on a pause. This isn't the first time this particular program has. Shehan, you've been a part of this since the beginning. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and any things you'd like to say.
Yeah, it's been crazy. I mean, to have a chance to do a podcast for going on 4 years, like that's just not something that many people are lucky enough to do. I got brought on by, of course, Doug Maurice back in 2021. And it's funny, actually. He said, because I actually met Doug doing the Football Writers Association of America All-America Committee. And he had never met me, never spoken to me, but he contacted me after that meeting, like this closed meeting among sports writers, and was like, hey, I don't know who you are, but you sounded pretty smart in that call and you knew what you were talking about. And I'm doing this podcast and I think that you'd be a perfect co-host. And I'm like, are you sure that that's enough of a sample size to hire somebody to co-host your podcast? And the funniest thing actually was he said, he was like, because I was at Dave Campbell's Sex Football at the time, for people who don't remember. He was like, look, I think you're great. My only worry is that you're going to get hired away in 6 weeks and not be able to do this show. And the irony was I got hired away by CBS only 2 months after we started doing the show. Thankfully, my boss at CBS let me do it. Even though I joined a new company, they let me do it for all these years. It's been a lot of fun. It's been ups and downs. We thought that, of course, we were going to get the 12-team college football playoff. It was pushed just a little bit. We had to deal with all the conference realignment stuff for multiple years, which was quite an adventure. We eventually got here, and of course, we lost Doug along the way to starting his own venture. Still alive, by the way. I don't know why I phrased it like that, but he's doing great. He's doing great.
No.
Yeah, he's moved on to his next life. But we were really lucky to bring on Bobak. We were really lucky to bring on Joey Aliberti as our producer. And it's been a ton of fun getting to do this podcast another year. I don't know whether I thought that we'd get that opportunity after Doug decided to start his own venture. So regardless of what happens from here, and certainly we hope that we'll get the opportunity to continue the show, but I'm really thankful to all of you for listening, for putting up with all of this, for putting up with the changes, for going on hiatus with us the first time and coming back and showing up again. I mean, I've heard from higher ups at Advanced Local, the company that our podcast is through, that this is consistently one of the more engaged with podcasts on their network, which is pretty humbling that people check in twice a week for an hour each time just to hear us drone on and on about the college football playoff. So it's not something that we take for granted. It's something that we feel very blessed to have had the opportunity to do. And whether it's here, whether it's somewhere else, whether it's checking out Bobak on Reddit, whether it's checking out me at cbssports.com. We certainly hope that you keep following us along, and we really just are so thankful for your supports.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to echo everything Sean just said. And I was very flattered when Scott Broder from Advance decided to reach out to me. When originally, the way this all came about, like, I know I have a radio voice. I've always had it. I've always been asked,
Yeah, you're so lucky, man. I've got this garbage, and you got your freaking
no. I realized something was up
gosh.
in elementary school in like third grade. They're like, "Do you want to hold the mic?" And I'm like, "What?"
They did not ask me to hold the mic. I can assure you of that.
Yeah. So they were. I've always been able to do that, but it was so funny because, as I've mentioned before, my background is I'm an attorney. I do this for the passion of the sport, on our CFP on Reddit, and they asked us to communicate. They asked us to help with a project they were doing. So I was the person who decided to try and be part of that, because actually it was interesting. We do our own media stuff, but I was the only one that said, like, yeah, I'll figure out a time. I'll come in and guest on a different episode, different show. And then Scott remembered me, and he's like, your voice, would you be interested in stepping in here? And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. And then Sean and I had met years ago, didn't know each other, but we kind of saw each other from across the room. I remember seeing, like, this guy's actually wears some nice shirts. I like that. And then we found the tweets like that you'd said about me back then, and they were like flattering. Don't get me wrong. Or you figured out that I was, teaching law and all that stuff. But and then end up on the same episodes together, as I've joked, pound for pound, the most complicated names in the college football media together.
Yeah. Shout out to Advance for putting Bobak Hayeri and Shehan Jayaraj on a podcast together. That's crazy.
But it's been an absolute pleasure. And again, hopefully we'll see you all again, or you'll hear from us again. But if not, it has been a pleasure speaking with all of you. It's been a pleasure working with Joey Aliberti. He's been a part of this, and we always enjoy talking with him before the episodes. We have our own little text chat, as many people do in this kind of work, and it's just been a pleasure to talk with all that, and it's been a pleasure to have all of you listening and being part of this. So regardless of what happens in the future, I just wanted to make sure I say that now, that it has been an absolute pleasure to be working with all of you and to have all of you as part of our conversation here on the College Football Survivor Show. Well, I guess I'll go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you all for listening, and hopefully you'll hear from us again. If not, it has been a pleasure. Thank you all, and we hope you all have a wonderful 2025 and beyond, no matter how this college football playoff works this season or beyond. Take care, everyone.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.